Hello and welcome to the Chthonia Monday live stream. I'm Breege Burke, and this is my usual Monday platform for talking a little bit about subjects related to the Chthonia podcast, to Chthonia as a larger venture, and other things that I'm doing. So I usually start with some updates, and then I will get into whatever my topic is going to be for the day, whatever it is that I was looking to talk about. It's an interesting day here. We have, but now after last week with a bit of chaos, we now have a new road outside. Now we have not had a new road in this, this particular road. I think from what I've been told by neighbors is that initially it was a dirt road even into the 1960s, and then they finally then they put some gravel down, then they sort of paved it, and nothing's really been done with it since around 1968. And it really showed, because anytime anybody had to come to the house to visit, or if I had clients come, or if my sister came to pick me up for anything, it was like, it's like, trying to drive on the moon, it was just absolutely cratered. And of course, it's a great deterrent when I'm trying to have clients here. It's like just one of those obstacles that I said, I really don't want clients to have to go and park on this road, which is also a one-lane road down here as well. It's 2 lanes a little farther down, but it's 1 lane down here. So there's really, it's just a nightmare if you're trying to do anything in your house in that way. So, I have this lovely space, but there's really only a select few people who actually come here. And of course, they're all people. Of course, being it's in my house, it's people that I've known and that I've worked with in person before. So it's not so it's not just bringing random people in usually. But yeah. So there's a whole lot that's been going on around that. It's been a chaotic couple of weeks, as I had mentioned. I'd had the power outage a couple weeks ago, and that really led to some weirdness around here, things that were going on. That was problematic. So it's kind of set me back in a lot of ways. July, August, and really June, July, and August, because I'm not teaching and I'm not getting teaching money. These tend to be months where I have to hustle a little bit more in terms of trying to make money, because there isn't any other kind of a backup, so I have to, or really the backup that I have is not really one that it's relying on it is very tenuous. So yeah. So anyway, there's just stuff going on, and I'm just trying to work my way through dealing with that. And so that generally means more marketing, more getting out there, more doing stuff. Part of it also is I'm doing a lot of clearing out of my space in my house and inventory and things that I have. So I do have about, I want to say 8 to 10 copies of Death and the Maiden that are there. Actually, you can kind of see them in a pile behind me. And I also have like a couple extra copies of Maeve, my novella Maeve, and then I also have, there's a few of Project Lethe. I'm not really sure what I want to do with those, because some of them are not the way that they were bound by. I think I've complained about this a few weeks ago about how the publisher had kind of messed up on the binding of those. So I don't know. So I have a few things that I'm probably going to put up for sale, and when I do, I think normally Death and the Maiden normally goes, I think, on Amazon for something like $21, $22. I'm probably going to try to sell it for less than that, probably maybe more in the neighborhood of like 15, and that would include shipping. So really, it's almost like charging 10 for it. So and I will sign the copies that I send out too. So if anybody's interested in that, I have to get it into my Squarespace inventory where I can have a kind of a link for people who want to purchase it. And also, I've still got, I think I'd mentioned I have my Edward Gorey sale going on eBay under Bribu, BRIBU, that's how they abbreviate my name, _6326. I have a bunch of items, a lot of rarities on there. Some of the smaller items have been snatched up. I think I've sold out of like 38 items. I think I've sold like 13, maybe 13 or 14. And good morning, Helen, or good afternoon in this case. Good evening for you. I've still got the Edward Gorey stuff up on eBay under BRIBU_6326. So that's kind of going, and I will have some of those other books for sale for people who want to get them. So I'm definitely kind of clearing out some inventory there. The other piece of news I have surrounding Chthonia is that I'm going to be having, it's actually Chthonia and it's my other venture, Transition Life Coaching. I'm actually putting together a series of classes, and these are actually going to be coming out really soon. Not this week, but maybe the following week. I'm thinking about doing some Thursday and Friday live classes, and these will be fairly inexpensive classes on a variety of subjects. A lot of them, obviously for this podcast, they'd be connected to the theme of the dark feminine. I know I have been approached in the past about doing things or discussing more about the dark feminine figures for those who are pagan practitioners. So there may be some of that I'm putting together, that I will put together. Probably some stuff on the underworld and understanding mythologies of the underworld, including up to our current ideas about heaven, hell, and things like that. I have things that I've put together on that, and probably I wanted to do. I get requests to do things on tarot because I read tarot and I read other oracles. But there's so many tarot classes out there. I mean, you can go on YouTube and get a free tarot class. I mean, there's so much there that I think rather than spending time doing another, here's the Fool's Journey of the Major Arcana, if I'm going to do a tarot class, I would rather talk about using tarot in a kind of like I'm going to call it a counseling atmosphere. But what I don't mean. I mean, it could be people who are therapists who decide to use it. Certainly, Jungian therapists and people who practice more traditional psychotherapy might make use of it. People who are involved in other therapies probably wouldn't, but people who might be coaches and things like that might make use of it as a tool. I know in my coaching, I make use of it as a tool. So explaining how one does that rather than trying to read it in terms of the other ways that people will tend to read it, more looking at it from the point of view of trying to work through unconscious content and things like that. So I may do a class on that as well, and how it connects to archetypes, because that seems to be a thing people are interested in. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to definitely be marketing that once that's ready to go. And I know I'm going to be bringing this school together that I'm working on, but I'm kind of trying to do things in steps. So I want to start by doing this and kind of see what kind of interest there is, and then find out what other classes people are interested in. And then that way I can start slowly bringing on instructors, and then slowly, hopefully, build it into something that's more like a semester type of thing, where we have some funding and things like that. But I'm starting small with what I've got right now, and we'll see how well that goes. The other thing that I've been getting a lot of requests or questions about is the fact that those first year worth of Chthonia podcasts went down. I even had an email yesterday from a new patron saying, what happened to episodes 1 through 10, and because I guess she just hadn't caught up with any of this or hadn't seen any of it. She did eventually see the Patreon post I did about it, but those are something that I'm going to work through and start editing. I'll probably even be having be able to do 1 or 2 in the next couple of days, and slowly I'm going to recreate those videos and put them back up. The actual content. Now, I'm not really sure about number 1. That was the first one that I did on Mother Goddesses, and I don't know if I have the audio for that one. I have to go look. If I don't, there's certainly still a place where I can upload and pull the transcript from, and I can do that one over again if I have to, based on the same original material, and then just creating new videos. They really needed to, people were very 50-50 on them, because there were some people who said, I don't care what they sounded like, you were great, it's a new thing, you're podcasting, and when you're learning, this is the way it is, and those people should just go away who don't like it. And I understand that sentiment. At the same time, if it's going to be one of those things where somebody sees that and then just says, I don't like the way this presenter sounds, so I'm not going to listen to any more of their podcasts, I really don't want it to be I don't want that to be a deterrent of people checking Chthonia out. So I thought let's just clean up the ones that we have, and then I'm going to repost them. So they might not necessarily be put back up in order like 1, 2, 3, 4. It might just be that. So we'll see what happens with that. So anyway, so that's the latest on that. So those people who were very sort of panicked that those episodes went away, because those are the things people really want to know about. Those were the episodes on, like I said, on Lilith, on Hecate, on Medusa, on like all of these earlier goddesses and everything, and those are the ones I did first, obviously, because they were kind of the most obvious ones. And so people are very like, oh my god, you're going to put those back. And so, and some people, like I know Frau Perkta and Grilla, that's a favorite of a lot of people too. Some of the ones that I did. So they will be back. I'm not, like I said, I do have audio. And if for some reason I don't have the original audio, I do usually have the video, in which case I can dump it into my video editor and I can strip the audio out and work with that audio and redo it. So, so they're all going to make their way back up. But like I said, I'm in the midst of a lot of things right now. And I've also, I had a big influx of messages in the last 3 days. Some of them are, a lot of them are WhatsApp and stuff. Some of them are quite long. So I'm going to be working my way through those as well. So if you haven't heard from me, and I know I got requests about certain podcasts on Facebook Messenger too. So again, I'm definitely going to get back to everybody. No worries. Gonna sort all that out. So yeah, a little bit of a long update this morning, but I just decided, well, let me just kind of lay a lot that out there at the beginning here. So yeah. So anyway, okay. So my topic that I wanted to talk about today had to do with writing the dark feminine. Now, this is actually going to be there's going to be a couple of different parts to what I want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk a little about my own writing, okay? Because a lot of people have asked, I've gotten random questions over different periods of time, people who have read my stuff and have questions about certain things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through each of my books. I'm not going to spend the whole live stream on this, but I'm going to go through some of my books and talk a little bit about how they were created. And some people asked about the inspirations for them, where it comes from, and why I wrote them the way that I did. And I'm hoping that in the process answers some of the questions about the writing. And then I want to get more into questions about writing dark feminine material particularly. And then probably end that with a discussion of where AI has fit into this, whether it should be involved in it or not. The fact that it does get used and you do have difficulties with entirely AI produced books being put out there. And obviously the people who are the scholars can read that right away and go, no, this book is wrong. It's not, it's just, I'm reminded of the days, the days back in the 90s and stuff when we had and they still have them, the random generators, when you would be like, random paper generator. I remember that one, like just you hit a button and it would give you some ridiculously, pompous sounding title for something. And sometimes it could even produce a whole paper for you. There was an experiment that had been done. I remember this was a real scandal for Elsevier, which is one of the big science publishers. I'm pretty sure it was Elsevier, where a paper was submitted, and it was one of those randomly generated papers, was submitted for peer review, and it passed peer review. But it was all rubbish. It was all just made up. And so there became the whole idea of, well, if you're paying all this extra money for Elsevier content because it's been properly vetted academically, then what does that mean when people are able to get away with doing that? What is that about? So yeah. So anyway, there's a whole I don't know. What do they want to call that? That's another kettle of fish. Is that the metaphor I'm looking for here, or the cliche, or the idiom, or whatever it is? So these are the books that are now. This is, mind you, I'm not talking about Death and the Maiden, which is an academic work published by Algora Publishing. I published it in 2019. I was asked recently why I don't publish everything just under Chthonia Books, and I feel the academic material should be vetted by somebody else. I feel like it's not. I mean, I could publish my own academic material, it'd be fine, but I mean, it wouldn't be the kind of thing that if you were going to use it in a paper, it would technically not be a legitimate source, because you want to make sure you've had that kind of, in the same way that you sometimes need to make sure that an account is verified or something. It provides that additional level of verification by the publisher. So so that's kind of why I always try to put my academic works out in either vetted, peer-reviewed, or at least reputable academic publishers, even if they're not doing peer review per se. So, okay, so this is just about my fiction, and all my fiction is produced by me. As you can see, they all have these lovely white color covers, except for this one. And this is the very first piece that I produced, and it is called Archetype Possession and 12 Dark Tales. Now, this book is dark. I'm not gonna, that's not a misnomer in any way, shape, or form. The very first story in particular is just one that I submitted that story originally to Dark Gothic Resurrected magazine, and I remember the editor writing to me going, holy crap, was I not prepared for that. But she loved it. She published it. So she got published there. And a lot of it is more, it's either like dark psychological kind of horror, or it's some of it's flat out horror. Some of it's just twisted. And the stories in here, now these do have, it's funny, I always have this kind of thing around archetypes, so there are definitely archetypal themes in these stories. And if I look at my table of contents here, and I do have in the back a list of, where do I have it here? Yeah, story credits, all the places where it was originally published, where I originally had submitted it. Now, this book, most of the contents of this book was written somewhere between 2008 and 2012. I had done a lot of short story writing. This is when I had started traveling and doing some other things, and I was just, I just had a lot of ideas kicking around that I decided to put into some kind of form. Now, not everything that I've written in that time period was published or put out for publication. There were some pieces that I thought, okay, this is more of a personal working out of something or something, and I don't need to share this with people. I have novels like that too, where it's just like, okay, this is more, it is something I do tend to recommend to people if they are able to do it. Just say, look, if you have an idea, if you are stressed about something and you have a or you have this theme or idea, or you've had this pattern in your life or something running through your head, like writing about it is a great thing to do. And writing about it, a lot of times we think that we do stuff and we're like, oh, but I have to do something with this. Like I have to sell it, and I have to. You don't necessarily have to. You can write things just to write them. You know, it's definitely a thing. So yeah, you can see me. I had my dark hair back then, so you know that was when I had just done that. And so this first book that I had written, this is actually, like I said, it's a short story collection, and the titles of the short stories are like Anima, Child, Magna Mater, Senex, Trickster, Umbra, Animus, and then I have those are all obviously archetypal. That's why this is called Archetype Possession, because it's about archetype possession in the Jungian sense is about the way in which our personalities can be overtaken by an archetype. And the most common time that happens is when we fall in love. Okay, so if you actually fall in love with somebody, then that is absolutely a case of archetype possession, because you are seeing your soul image in that person, and no matter what that person is, okay, whether that person is right for you, wrong for you, this person could just be like, there could be all kinds of red flags. Stay away from that person. But nonetheless, you can't help yourself. I mean, because you're literally, and Carl Jung had said that too in his discussion of the anima. He says, well, he says, I have people come and they say to me, doctor, help me get rid of this woman, because and he says, you can't. He says, you're just caught by the archetype. So that's the most obvious example that most people deal with. Now, there's obviously other types of archetype possession as well. I've actually known people to say, for instance, be possessed by like a child archetype, where they just have this absolute obsession about either being the child of a particular person or about mothering that particular person as a child, like to the point that it's actually like bizarre. It's not. So I have seen this happen, and the person, when you talk to them about it, they're like, I don't know, I'm compelled. I can't break out of it. I can't break out of it. So it's these kinds of things where we feel like something in the unconscious grabs us and compels us, and there's all kinds of, you can have all kinds of theories about where that comes from. If you do certain kinds of magical work and things, you're kind of like, okay, there's something you're doing that's connected to that. Obviously, some people, when they do certain kinds of workings, they become a vehicle for a particular entity or a particular deity or something like that. So that kind of a thing can happen, but this is in the more general sense, the way in which we certain things that are when an archetype, as they say, constellates, when it comes around to our field of vision, it can actually take us over, and it can cloud what we think of as the identity that we have control over. Okay, It can be a temporary thing, and it can be a longer term thing. So, so there's a whole lot about that. You don't necessarily hear it talked about in those terms today. We tend to think of something as either being psychotic, schizoid, or some other kind of disorder, none of the above. What they were calling the, being on the spectrum of what they still call autistic disorders, rightly or wrongly. That's what they call them. There's all kinds of things that people will talk about, but they rarely talk about it in Jungian terms. So I use the Jungian terms. But anyway, so this one is really very dark. There are some love stories in here, but they're pretty strange, and maybe sometimes demented ones. There are stories about children. There are stories about fears of strangers. And kind of how those fears play out, or fears of the unknown, or fears of the dark, or fears of the forest. A lot of that is in here. Just Like is actually kind of a cruel piece, I think, actually. But it came to me and I was just like, okay, it's funny in a bizarrely way that might be not funny to some people. So there's just a lot of different things, ideas that I had played around with around this theme. And really the way this book came together, which it looks like I put it out in 2018. I remember I was sitting in my office one night and I was just looking at my list of stories, and I was trying to write new stories, and I think I was kind of going through a dry spell of doing that. And I just said, you know what, F it, I'm just going to take the ones that I have that have already been published, and I'm going to make a collection. And, CreateSpace on Amazon is great for that. It's actually, even though it's not considered to be optimal, and obviously once you create it there, that's the only place you can sell it. That's the problem. That's the limitation of it. But at that point, I didn't care. This wasn't like something that I was like trying to put. I was just like, I just want to get these stories out there in some form. So I put the book together. I think I put it together. I was working late in my office one night, and I just went in, put it all together. I had a hard time doing the Kindle version at that point, but later on, just probably maybe even just last year, I put the Kindle version together and put that out as well. For some reason, it just refused to format properly, which is a problem I have with EPUB in general. EPUB does not, it's very, very difficult. I had this problem with Ingram too, so I have no idea what the ebooks are going to look like on people's readers. I tried to put it in a reader format that I have through Apple Books, and it just... and if you try to put certain things to try to maintain the original formatting, then it would literally squish every other line together on the top of the page for no apparent reason. And all other kinds of things too. There's a lot about the way that print on demand works with fonts and everything. Like I look at the fonts of my other books, and so the next book that I had published after Archetype Possession was Maeve. Okay, and Maeve. It's one of my favorites, I have to say, if I'm going to critique my own work. There are actually reviews of Maeve. I've had some people review this book whose opinions I respect a lot, because they are definitely very imbued in the literary world. And some of them, given the subject material, some of them are also just experts in what the subject material of this actually were. And it got like 2 thumbs up from everybody. So people really do like this one. And this is one of the ones that I have some extra copies of if people want them. As you notice, the print is just really, really large. Now, mind you, this is 12-point font. 12-point is just pretty standard fixed width font stuff. And I'm using, I don't remember which font I used. I always try to use a fixed width, because usually that deals with how it's going to display. That may be more on a computer than in print, but it just, and because this one, like if I compare it to Project Lethe, for some reason, like the page numbers get pushed down to the bottom here, which I use the exact same formatting for Maeve, and you see that they're not. So, I don't know. Ingram is, they're the ones that produce the books, and it's a conundrum, because I said, well, I could try to go and have them printed up nicely, by a more formal press, but the cost of that goes up exponentially, and how much I have to charge for each book goes up exponentially. And I'm trying to keep these in a range. I want people to read them. I know there's books that you can make that are meant to be like collector's pieces, and that's fair enough. But these are not. I mean, maybe at some point I can make collector's editions of these for people who want them and who want the nice, hardcover on their shelf. But it's just in terms of making money, what I would have to charge to put a hardcover out would be obscene. So, and probably nobody would read it. So I'm kind of having to weigh those kinds of things and making decisions about where I'm going to publish it. But I do everything on the Chthonia books imprint, mainly because the topics of my book, when you go and you query a publisher about books, they want to know what genre you're writing in. Okay, they say, what's the genre of this? So what are some of your typical fiction genres? Like you have like romance, or you might have fantasy, or you might have science fiction, or sometimes you have things that are like LGBTQ kind of based, or you may have things that are feminist based, or you may have, there's all these different categories. And the problem that I have always had with writing, and this has always been a problem when I've approached traditional publishers, the frequent thing I will get back from them is, we love this work, we just don't know how to market it. Because it's all, because category-wise, even my academic work is like, I think it ended up being classed by the publisher as philosophy, but it's psychology, it's depth psychology, really. It's feminism, it's, ancient religion, it's literature, it's like everything kind of one package. Because, I don't know, I pull my influences from so many different places, and a lot of times people say, well, we want you to focus on like one discipline or area. But when you're writing creative works, that's a very, very hard thing to do. You can't just say, there's that fine line that you walk between creating something that is that follows a certain standard, I guess, or what people or what the expectation is going to be about how something is supposed to be written, or if you're talking about music or art or whatever. There's always a kind of a standard, and of course the standard is something I could go off on another tangent about. I had arguments with, when I was in graduate school, not really arguments, but just, it was really interesting when you asked these lit professors who were very well established and had published and were critics and everything else, and I'd say to them, okay, so let's talk about poetry, for instance. What makes a good poem? Like, how do I know, as the reader, that what I'm reading is good and not crap? Like, how do I know that? And nobody really has a good answer to that. Sometimes people look at it and go, oh, that poetry is awful. And it's like, well, what's awful about it? Oh, well, it doesn't follow this or that. Well, okay, well, not all poetry has to be in iambic pentameter or in some kind of a thing. There is free verse poetry. There's blank verse. Why does it have to follow? Why is it, unless you're only publishing things in that particular format, why does it have to be like that? It's like you're balancing that need for a structure. Okay, structure within something works. And the idea of this maybe wanting to be creative and breaking outside of that structure. So, and the writing that I do, okay, starting with Maeve, I've had some people, like I said, some people absolutely love this book. Other people, I have one friend who reads a lot of rather traditional popular fiction, who she said this book just absolutely like she couldn't deal with this book. She was just like, oh my God, she's like, the structure of it was too upsetting for me. I need standard chapters. I need this. And it wasn't her thing. That's fine. But she was just really like unsettled by the book, which is the point, actually. Maeve is written, I want to say it's written a little like a Jim Jarmusch film. If you remember Jim Jarmusch, because he was very popular in the 90s, and I've seen a lot of his works. He had like Down by Law, and Coffee and Cigarettes, Night on Earth, like all of those. But he had some really pretty big name stars, and he also seemed to have Tom Waits in all of them too. It was kind of weird, or Roberto Benigni, like they were always in these movies. But like if you think about a thing like Night on Earth, for instance, that's where you have 5 cab drivers in 5 different cities around the world and scenes. So one's in France, or one is in in Helsinki. I think they're in Paris. One's in Helsinki. One's in New York. One's out in, I think, L.A. And there's these different scenes, and you have these cab drivers and their interactions with the people in the car, and the way. And some of them, you have all these dialogues that will eventually come together at the end of the film. Somehow they all kind of end up overlapping or meshing together in some way. Like there's some kind of, you've got all these different strands and then they come together. Another writer who I know writes a little like that is Philip Tremblay. Now I'm not going to compare myself to Philip Tremblay, but he is, but just in terms of his narrative style. If you read Head Full of Ghosts, which to me is still my favorite novel by him, I've read a lot of stuff by him, and that one is still my absolute favorite, which is about a reality TV show about this supposed haunting, but you're not really sure whether there's a haunting or whether the girl in the house is having class is having a schizoid episode or something like that. And then, of course, the ending is a shock, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because you haven't read it. But that's also written in, it's like, okay, this chapter is from the point of view of this person. This chapter is from the point of view of another person, And that's literally how Maeve is written. The first chapter is, and of course I also have some of my artwork, which does not translate well in CMYK color, thanks Ingram, but it's just the limitations of print on demand. I have different things that I've done, and all the artwork is mine, or the photos are mine, but they're meant to convey certain things, and they're kind of meant to show the kind of Maeve herself is somebody who she's a bit of an enigma, and that's kind of the point. We don't know who Maeve is. It's a story that begins with this woman who is, and by the way, rock and roll lifestyle is definitely a component of a lot of my stories, because I don't know, that's just a milieu where I feel like there's a lot of fantasy projection in that milieu. And I grew up, I was a child in the 1970s, and I was a teenager in the 80s. So this was still the era where you had your rock gods, and you had these people who were larger than life. Now it's a kind of a different ballgame with that, with a lot of changes in the culture. But you had these ideas of these guys who were like the rock gods, who wear the skin tight trousers and have their junk, stick it in your face, and things like that. And they would have the long hair, and they were just very, and all these people worshiping them and stuff like that. I mean, this was kind of a thing, right? And and that was still the era where you had the posters on your wall and stuff. I don't know if kids do that these days. I have no clue. But it's but that was kind of the era of that. And when you got to the 80s, especially when you had a lot of the 70s rock gods, the weird thing happened to them in the 80s. It's like they're trying to fit in with 80s culture, which is already a weird thing. Fashion-wise, I would love to forget the 1980s, honestly. Although the 70s were not necessarily great either. My mother used to make our clothes, and my mother, by the way, was a fantastic seamstress. It's not that she didn't know how to sew. It was just what she would choose to sew. We could never quite work out why she picked the fabrics she did or anything else. But anyway, that was the 70s. And of course, we've all seen some of these, pictures of some of the monstrosities that era in the late 60s as well. But there's also a lot of cool stuff that comes out of it as well. So I don't know. I have a nostalgia for things. Almost all my pants are flare bottoms. I'm sorry. It's also the shape of my body. I tend to be more A-line, so I like things that kind of A-line. But in any case, there was definitely, you would see these kinds of guys who were so drug ravaged from the 70s, and then they got into the 80s, and they were walking around looking like they were like refugees at a Jimmy Buffett concert or something. I mean, it was a lot of them. It's not just one. So yeah, so one of the questions I'll have about inspiration is, well, when you you write about a singer or you write about a guitarist, who is your inspiration? Like, who are you writing about? And I'm like, I'm not writing about anybody in particular. In a way, I'm writing about all of them. Because I'd read so many stories, because I was in that era, I read a lot of rock biography, and I'd seen things, and I'd read articles, I read Rolling Stone, I read all that stuff. So I have this kind of composite image of the rock star from that era, especially once they've become, I don't necessarily want to say they're a has-been, but when they're kind of have gotten out of rehab and are trying to reinvent themselves, it's that kind of a character. And these characters, for some reason, are always the centers of my stories. Not all of them. Although I'm just looking at these three here, and I said, not the second half of Morrigan Timelines. Well, no, actually, yeah. I'll say that. They all have that. And actually, the new one that just came out this past weekend, which was Regenerator, that one is live and available, is also about a bass player. It's about, but they're all, a lot of them connect back to this work, which is the Morrigan Timelines. And but Maeve is kind of a standalone here. It is about somebody who is a rock and roller, like an older one, who has and again the traditional, we're going to call it the accessory wife, right? The one who's just who's beautiful and blonde and has, I don't know. They're usually there. They maybe they've done modeling, maybe they've done but they're kind of there to be like eye candy with the rock star, and they might have a good relationship too. I'm not saying that they don't, but you do see a lot of these relationships where it's like, you have to pick the wife that has a certain look, So Maeve is interesting because it's about one of these rock stars, and of course, who has all the traditional, they have the house in LA, they have this, they've got, no matter where they're from. And so it's that kind of a person and that kind of a lifestyle. But this is where you have this old rock and roller who is married to this woman, and he thinks just something. They have like a morning where they do their normal morning routine, and then all of a sudden he just turns on her. He just turns cold, and she doesn't know what's happened. And he ends up, because the first thing is called a disappearance and a reappearance. That's the first section of it, where he just like takes off, and then he shows up again. He leaves a note, but he shows up again like 2 weeks later wanting a divorce. And she has no idea what's happened. Like, no, she's just blindsided, gobs, what the heck just happened here? And then not a month later, he seems to pick up with another woman who's the polar opposite of her, the absolute polar opposite of her. And she can't figure out what was he cheating with her? But apparently, because he said, no, I wasn't cheating on you. I just literally, it's like he met this woman and just suddenly wanted to get married to her 6 weeks later. And it's like, what is happening here? Like, what's happening? But he moves, he's lived in the United States, he moves back to the UK, and he ends up employing a housekeeper called Maeve. And that's the thing, because then the ex-wife tries to come to try to talk to him, to try to get closure, and the door opens and she runs into Maeve. And Maeve is not looking at her with any kind of, she seems to really, really like the new wife, who's called Morgan. Really, really doesn't seem to like the ex-wife. Really cold, really, so there becomes, and then she starts having nightmares about this housekeeper. And where all of this goes, it gets weird. It really gets weird. And then the ending is a bit of a surprise for a lot of people about who Maeve is and what's gone on there. But as one reviewer had said, she said, well, you do tie it up very nicely in the end. We don't have any loose threads where we're like, what the F, you figure out what's going on here. So I just feel that Maeve is one of my favorite works, even though it's very non-standard, doesn't have traditional chapter headings and stuff like that. I do like Maeve. And Morrigan Timelines, this was something that was 30 years in the works, and it has a lot to do with my encounters with, let me amend that. It's not that it has to do with my encounters with Morrigan, but when I first started, in my own practices, having encounters with the goddess Morrigan, which was probably back in 1986, 87, I want to say 87, like around then. The way that she presented and came through to me was something, I was still fairly new in paganism and all that kind of stuff, so it was something, I literally just walked away from Catholicism and all of this stuff, and so there was still a whole lot that I was processing there and that was going on. But initially, I felt like it was like her influence was coming through in kind of stories and story characters. So the character for this story, who is Layla, she's had several other names in the past, which I won't get into, but she's had, she's kind of developed this personality, almost like she's an egregore, right? But she's developed this kind of personality. And so this is the personality that I'm calling the Morrigan here. Now, people have asked me, they said, well, is this a story about the Morrigan? And I'm kind of like, yes and no. And people say, well, make up your mind. Which one is it? I'm like, well, and it kind of gets into one of the things that I've actually wanted to say about fiction writing on the dark feminine, because there's a whole question around authenticity. I have seen certain pagan writers get very annoyed with people who write fiction and turn these particular characters, especially the dark feminine characters, your Lilith, your Medusa, your Morrigan, and turn them into characters that are not true to what, say, the texts are about them, or the understanding of them and their energies and their qualities. And then people will say, well, and I understand the argument to a point, because they're saying, it's kind of like when I read things like for example, there's that whole Percy Jackson series on Greek myth, right? And a lot of my students will come to my class going, oh yeah, Greek myth, I read Percy Jackson. And I'm like, that's not an accurate representation of Greek myth. But it's not meant to be. That's the thing. You have to always, it's kind of like, okay, if you want to learn what the stories, at least what the ancient stories are, then you take a myth class and you kind of learn, why, why Athena would not have any children, things like this. Like, you kind of learn about this kind of material, but you realize that this is something that sparks the initial interest. I remember teaching one myth class where you're talking about Heracles, and I had a student raise my hand and go, well, professor, what about the time when Heracles did this? And I'm like, Heracles never did that. And then I'm trying to find out from the guy, I'm like, where did you get this from? He's like, oh, well, it's in the Disney movie. Ah, okay. I was like, yeah, that's Disney. Disney is not looking necessarily, they're loosely basing it on a narrative. You're not looking at historical accuracy here. So yes, it's a learning experience for a lot of them, and to me, there's absolutely no reason why you can't take license with those characters or with those images. But then if you're actually going to go into practice, if you read something like that and say, well, that inspires me, I'm interested in going into practice and worshiping or setting up an altar or interacting with this particular energy. What you learned in that fiction book may not really represent what they are, and probably that should be the expectation. You take it with a grain of salt, because when you're writing fiction, my whole thing is with people, when anybody asks me, I'm like, you should be able to take license the way you want to, okay? Unless you are setting out to write a work of historical fiction and you are branding it that way, in which case, yeah, you're probably going to have to pay a lot more attention to the historical particulars of something. Then otherwise, really, the field is open. These are just energies and characters. And honestly, when you're talking about dark feminine characters, like really ancient ones, you're not talking about characters that are... the reality is, even people who are modern, consider themselves modern devotees of a particular goddess or something, the bottom line is you don't really know what, let's say if you were going to go back to archaic times, how that deity was worshipped. We're worshiping deities now, or working with them, or corresponding with them, or magically getting involved or anything, whatever we're doing. You're doing it in a modern context. Everything's done in a modern context. One of the critiques of modern Wicca, because a lot of times Wicca would say like, oh, it's the world's oldest religion, and people, basically the scholars went, oh, no, you're not, because the scholarship that was sort of proved that, was a lot of it was bogus, or at least it was just not very good scholarship. But the bottom line was, I remember Jake Stratton Kent had said this. He said, well, so what? Like, it's a modern religion. I mean, yeah, it's not the world's oldest religion, but why not revive paganism? You have to revive it in modern terms, so revive it in modern terms. You don't have to be like, oh, well, this is not true to the way the you probably don't want to do things the way that, like, if you're talking about Celtic deities, like the way that they did stuff, there's a lot of beheading and skinning of people. I don't know that we're really going to get away with that now. I mean, and I don't know that that's necessarily, it's our interest in those deities is for an entirely different reason, and it's a different function. So I don't think it's worth, yes, we're interested in, the history is interesting. The authenticity of that is interesting. And I know to a certain degree, you want to really understand, especially if you're working with these deities in some kind of a ritual setting, you want to understand what you're working with to make sure that that's what you're working with, for one thing. And then to be careful that you're not creating what they call an egregore, which I was just talking about, which is basically, it's an image that it's something that's created more in your mind, because your mind you can create thought forms, you can create egregores, and that this is not simply an egregore and not the actual thing. I mean, these are all the permutations that you deal with as you learn to get involved in that kind of practice. But so Morrigan timelines, that's why I say it's like, yeah, this is the character is based on my impression of the Morrigan's personality as she presents herself to me. But remember the word personality, that's just the face that they're showing. She's a shapeshifter. She can show any face that she wants to. And so, yeah, so the characters here, whenever the Layla character appears, she is some aspect of the Morrigan. And the main aspects that I'm showing here in this particular novel, and the reason it's called Timelines is because I've kind of put two different stories in, but there's, like I said, there's different strands. There's like different outcomes with the same characters. So Morrigan Timelines is kind of, the first part is more of the Layla, who is a little bit more, she's cheekier, she's more seductive, she's a little bit, sassier. And she is definitely a kind of a magnet. She's like a very sexualized. She's overly sexualized, actually, in the way that she behaves. And that doesn't sit well with some people who have read this, because they said, well, she's too young to be acting like that. I said, yeah, but the point is that she's not a regular person. She's got this very weird birth story, and it's and she is literally, she appears to be a person, but you can kind of be around her and kind of sense that she's really not. She's kind of taken the form of a person, and she's the daughter, of course, again, of this very famous musician. And so it's the way he tries to contend with her, and then the way that she is when she's out and about, and the kind of havoc she creates initially with people. But she's also, I don't know, there's something often weirdly angelic about her too, and it's just kind of like, well, I'm doing this because this is the thing I have to get done. And she has this kind of way about her. And then in the second part, it's a completely different one. This is more of the sovereignty goddess who is betrayed. She's not really following the loathly lady kind of archetype, because loathly lady, I mean, then she would just be like what would we consider to be an ugly, like, hag figure or something, right? But she's not. She's still a beautiful, but she has this. This is where we get into the themes of neglect and betrayal. And it's more the idea that you still have this beautiful goddess who feels neglected and betrayed, and the way in which that gets processed in a kind of rationalistic structure, and then eventually, what happens to kind of break her out of it, and how that ties in with the ancestral stuff with her as well. So it is definitely a story that is not, I can't say, oh yes, this has to do with the ancient myths of the Morrigan about this and this. It's not. There's license definitely being taken here. And of course, the ending is this idea of this battle that goes on, but it's not. I always feel like this work. It's good. I mean, I do like this work, but I feel like there's an element of it that feels unfinished to me, which is why I ended up writing some of these other books. And Project Lethe, I mean, it was like a 4-year gap between Morrigan Timelines, because Morrigan Timelines I was writing since the late 80s. And it was like, I got to a point, and this is another point too. You can write something to a point. It's kind of the expression is shit or get off the pot. Like, you've got to get to a point where you say, all right, this is the narrative. I'm satisfied with where this is, and this is how I'm going to publish it. For better or for worse. At some point, you got to make the leap. Because like I could go back and reread it and go, oh, maybe I should have done this. Maybe I should have done that. You will do that forever. You will do that forever if you're a writer. You're never going to get... There's always going to be something that you're going to go back and think, and who knows, down the road, I mean, that's not to say that if you've published a work, you can't revise it a little bit, or you can't, but when you're creating fiction, you just kind of got to let the piece stand as it is. There's going to be things that are good about it, and things maybe that, maybe later on you go, maybe I wish I didn't do that. We all have stuff like that. But some people have, like I said, that one has not been particularly reviewed. People have told me, though, people have read it, though. Like I said, some people have some issues, particularly with the early chapters. When Layla is very, very small child, and some of the things that go on, they're like, ooh, even understanding the rationale, they're not real comfy with it. So probably should have put some trigger warnings in this one. But so there are a few things that are a little dark there. But again, I said, you really have to go at it with the understanding that the human that you see is only apparent. That's not really what's behind the facade there. That's not really what you're looking at. And that's the only way you're going to be able to understand and process this, by not trying to equate it with yourself as a human and your own feelings. Kind of the point, the reason that she is so outrageous in some of the things that she does, is to point out, if we think about the nature of the ancient gods are they're kind of a... okay. If you read to people's studies of Greek mythology in particular, I'm just going to use Greek mythology because it seems to be ubiquitous in schools and stuff like that. We will talk about the gods as being capricious, or if you've ever been taught religion growing up, their whole thing would always be like, oh, well, we have a personal relationship with God, and God is interested in morals and ethics and judgments, because that's what modern religion's about. It's about ethics, morals, and judgments. The whole point is that ancient religion is not. Okay, when you're talking about ancient gods, it's not that there's not certain boundaries that they have, that there's not certain rules that they follow. that Zeus, as king of the gods, he technically could do a lot more stuff than what he does, but he has a certain limit to what he'll do. I mean, then there's the idea of the role of fate and what does fate have to do. But the gods are generally, compared to what we tend to think of with respect to modern religion, are often defined as capricious. And as I've taught my students, when I talk about ancient religion, I said the whole point of the ancient gods is that this is not a cult of moral religion. You don't typically have, like nowadays you'll have people who say, oh, well, I'm a devotee of, I don't know, Artemis. I'm a devotee of, Hecate. I'm a devotee of whatever. And it's like, you wouldn't really have had a devotee. I mean, you might have had people who were dedicated, priests or priestesses, or depending on the deity. But it wouldn't have been like you as an individual would necessarily have this super personal relationship with the deity, and that the deity would have a super personal relationship with you. Even in cases where you might have somebody who, like for example, Artemis is a good example. In mythology, you have followers of Artemis who, and some of them like she favors, like Hippolytus, right? And she loves Hippolytus, but Hippolytus scorns Aphrodite. Okay, and of course you don't. When you scorn Aphrodite, usually one of three things happens. Either if you are in a marriage, your spouse is going to cheat on you. If you are in his case, and this has happened in other cases, when you make her mad, she makes usually one of the parents fall in love with you. That creates an incest kind of situation. And the third thing that she might do is, of course, also just render somebody very, unattractive and undesirable. I mean, you see less of that. It's more of the first two that you see in myth. But with Hippolytus, it's Phaedra, his stepmother, who falls in love with him, and of course he's not going to do that. But then she goes and tells Theseus, his father, that he came at me, he assaulted me, and then he got put to death for it. It was only later that Theseus found out that it was a lie. But this was the workings of Aphrodite. And what was interesting about that is he's a devotee of Artemis. So you might say, well, where was Artemis? Why didn't she step up to the plate and save her one of her favorite devotees? And basically Artemis's response is, yeah, but he insulted Aphrodite. Like it's got nothing to do with the personal thing. And what she ended up doing after his death is then he had sort of got set up, I think it's a Viribus in the Roman. He's set up as this kind of other deity with like almost like an ancestral deity with his own shrine kind of thing. So that was about the best she could do for Hippolytus, but certainly wasn't going to save him in that sense. That's a very modern idea. So basically the gods just do what they want. I mean, you look at all of the escapades of Zeus. You look at all these are things. There's some of these things that we can identify with as humans. But there's also a lot of it that just seems very exaggerated and outrageous, and it's because they're the gods. They don't have to follow the rules, ethics, and norms. This is my problem with Plato, because Plato's always just like, well, that's not really right for the king of the gods to be cheating on his wife. Well, okay, in a human sense, yeah, probably not. But the point isn't even that. The point is that he's not a human being. My problem with humanism in general, that aspect of it, is that you're trying to treat the gods like they're just like you, and because we have intelligence, we're just like them. And it's like you're not talking. These energies they're not like you. They're different. They have personalities that they may present in a way of us being able to interface with them, but they're not the same. And that's really the point of some of the outrageous stuff in Morrigan Timelines, is to say, yeah, she's not a person. There's many things about her that make her look, and walk and talk like a person. It's the old, if it quacks like a duck and if it whatever, it's a duck, right? Well, this is not quite the same thing here. It's a little bit different. She appears to be one thing, but she's a shapeshifter by definition. So, and this of course is a very modern thing. As I was saying earlier, if you're going to try to write historical fiction, then you have a little bit, then you're a little bit more wedded to trying to get the facts right. But there's an interesting thing about fantasy and fantasy writing. I remember reading an article a few years ago, and I've probably talked about this before, so I don't want to be repetitive here. But there was an article that I had read about American fantasy fiction versus British fantasy fiction in particular. This was just a comparison. And one of the things that was really noted by the author was that if you read a lot, there's a lot in British fantastical literature. I mean, we can take Harry Potter. I know J.K. Rowling's a terrible example now for a lot of reasons, but let's just not, whatever we think of her personally. Certainly, the way that Harry Potter was certainly very popular. That's British fantasy writing, and that was kind of the example of, when you talk about Hogwarts and you talk about that, you're talking about a total fantasy setting. You're not really talking about a setting that's realistic in any way. When you talk about American writing, now there is straight up fantasy writing that people have. They have these world building that people do with these different fantasy authors, where you have this kind of variations on Middle Earth or whatever it is. You can have that, but a lot of times with American fantasy writing, there's this sense that there has to be something about it that's realistic, or science fiction is probably a better example. If you write something, it has to be something that sounds plausible and viable, because a lot of times we seem to, in the US, we can't seem to put ourselves into a story unless it feels real to us in some way, unless we can relate it to our experience, rather than just allowing ourselves to be imaginative about something and to allow world building to go on. Some people want something that they feel, and again, people read for different reasons, when they do read anymore, which is another issue. But when you do read, you're kind of like, you want to do this world building. You want to you want to be able to, in a certain sense, take yourself out of day-to-day life. That's part of the point. It's like an escape. The same way you might watch like a ridiculous movie or something. It's not. Sorry, I'm itchy. It's sort of about the way in which we escape from things, and the way in which we escape from different stuff. And so for me, it's not. If something isn't entirely realistic, I mean, if you're trying to judge it on that basis, if that person is trying to write a recreation of that time. For example, there have been some novels more recently about the Trojan War from, say, the female point of view. And I know somebody who had actually read one of them, and I forget which one it was. I forget the title of it. But I think it was trying to go from the point of view of Briseis, who was the one at the very beginning of the Iliad. She's the one who is she's the kind of concubine. She's kind of the concubine who was taken as loot by Achilles, and she becomes kind of a point of argument for between him and Agamemnon. So it's supposed to be telling it from Briseis' point of view. So you're kind of wedded to that historical environment when you're writing something like that. But somebody said that one of my friends who was reading it, she said, Briseis talks like she's from like Northern England. I mean, it was just kind of it's weird. Like there's certain things that you're going to notice when you're reading things like that, because the way in which the author is trying to interpret that. There's still a certain amount of license, but you may be kind of boxed in a little bit more by historical context. So not that it can't be done, but I don't know. I guess the point is whether or not you want to judge something on whether it's realistic or not. It's or whether or not it's always true to the character. I think it's a big problem, and this kind of led to what I was going to say about AI, and that is that we now are at a point where people don't necessarily know the difference between things. We don't, even though librarians and library science still exists, we don't necessarily have a good platform for determining truth from falsity. Okay. And that's a problem, because there's so much information all the time. There's me, I'm talking at you here. There's tons of stuff on Instagram. There's tons of videos on YouTube. There's a ton of content that as soon as we open our phones is just in front of us every single day. And how do you determine what's good and what's BS? I mean, there are some tools out there to help you do that. But AI certainly complicates things. We have bots that throw things out there. You see how when fake stories are thrown out to try to mess up the results of an election or do something like that. You have this problem where this kind of thing can happen, and so then you have this other problem too of AI, people who use ChatGPT and use all these different things. And again, it's not that doesn't have its uses. I don't want to say that it's completely useless for everything, or that it's just a bad thing or an evil or whatever. It's not. I mean, no, it's. I use it for certain things. When I'm brainstorming, I use ChatGPT. and I'm not about writing an entire book, but I might just be like, okay, I need a title for this. Here, ChatGPT, this is what I'm doing. And it'll give me like 10 things, and I'll be like, okay, I don't necessarily have to use any of them, but it might get me thinking about which direction I want to go in. It can be a good jumping off point a lot of the times. But it's very concerning when people think like, well, I don't have time to write this. So, I mean, this happens a lot with academic papers. I don't have time to sound smart enough for the professor. So I'm just gonna throw it into ChatGPT, and that sounds good enough, and I'm just gonna turn it in, and she's probably not gonna notice. And unfortunately, if I'm your professor, then yes, I am gonna notice, because I know stylistically what the AI is doing, and also, this is also the reason when I teach my classes, I'm like, you have to talk about the material that I lectured on. Like, I don't want to hear about all this other stuff. If I ask you to do a research paper, that's different. But if I'm asking for something where I need your feedback on the lecture, and you give me all this stuff that's not in the lecture, I'm like, we didn't talk about that. Write that again. Write that again from your point of view. And don't worry about sounding smart, okay? Just write about it from your point of view. So anyway, So there's some concerns about that, and as we've noted, there's entire books that have been written now by AI. And if you don't know how to vet things, this is what I was saying earlier about why I want my academic work not on the Chthonia imprint. I want it on, even though what I produce on the Chthonia imprint is all fiction. Okay, it's all fictional stuff. It could be fiction, it could be poetry. It's going to be stuff that's creative in that sense. Anything that's academic, I like to produce through something that's going to either be peer-reviewed or at least that has a good reputation as an academic publisher if they're not specifically doing peer review. So I want to publish things through reputable publishers, because to me, things that are self-published are only suspect. There could be great scholarship in it, but it's not always easy to tell that. It's not always easy for people to vet that. They'd have to look at the author and know what the credentials of the author and what the background is, and then assuming that that's not made up, because apparently that's a thing you can do now too. And so, and AI is just, and the books that they produce, like I said, anybody who is a scholar or knows anything about it it's not going to take people very long to read it, to figure out what's going on. Like they wait a minute, this isn't right. And so the fact that, because AI just cannibalizes stuff. It just takes old stuff and it kind of regurgitates it. Which, when I think about it, that is kind of what academic papers do, don't they? I mean, it's just you have a topic and you say, well, here's what all these people said on this topic. That's a little easier to do that with, I suppose, if you had valid sources. But when it comes to certain other things, AI is not. You can definitely tell the difference. Now, people say, over time, you're not going to know the difference. Well, but the question then becomes, as people, like, why do you want to give your creativity over to that? And this may be why we're in a time where I feel like some of the rules surrounding creativity, because obviously, we have, as I was saying earlier, we have structures. We have structures for what a story should be like, what a short story should be like, what a novel should be like, what poetry should be like. Although, again, we're not really clear on what the components need to be to make that good. You know what I mean? We don't, some of it's just a matter of taste. But I feel like it's important that we don't over confine ourselves to certain structures. That you want to, like experimental fiction is a really cool thing. One of the coolest authors I've ever read is Italo Calvino, where he will go in and he will, but he basically will just write these stories like what was it? If on a winter's night, a traveler, like right where he starts, and it's like this it's almost like it's not quite a choose your own adventure, but it's almost like you start in this one place and somehow the narrative just kind of just suddenly starts going into all of these different places, and there's somebody too, and I don't remember if it was him or not, who wrote an entire novel like not using the letter E. Like it's like there's just stuff that people do that's like really fascinating to me that they're able to do that. Stuff like Danielewski's House of Leaves. If you're interested in that kind of more that darker kind of writing. That everything about that trashes the whole idea of novel. I mean, it's so all over the place, but and it takes a lot of work to get through it, but it's still considered to be this really almost monumental work in what it does. So I think it's like we need to, there's a need to kind of break out of some of these forms that we've been using, and trying to, if we're going to kind of work in those directions. And also, I think just being too overly focused, even if we don't want to go that far out and experimental, the way in which we may try to constrain authors by saying, well, you're only supposed to write this way, and this is only supposed to be this way, and this is only supposed to be that way, and this is the formula you need to follow. I mean, if you need structure and you want to write according to formulas, if you have an idea and you want to pop it into a structure and work with it, I mean, sure. I mean, but I don't know that we always want to do that. And I don't know that it's such a great idea to hand our creativity over to a machine. To me, it's like the thing I posted the other day. I want AI to like wash my dishes and do the laundry. I don't want AI to like write my books for me. That to me is not the best use of AI. AI is something that helps us deal with things that are more general or more rote. And when you try to, and I know that their whole goal is that they want to try to do that. I'm like, well, how intelligent do you want to make this thing? And the thing is, to what degree it can only really imitate the human spirit or human empathy or it can only imitate it. I don't know. That's why a lot of times when you see things like that, when you see robotics and things, they're often viewed as being uncanny, because there's still something about them, even if they do a really good approximation of things, that's just still, you can tell that you're not dealing with a person. Or in the way that they're trying to copy people through AI and stuff. I don't know. It's like I don't want to be a Luddite about new things that are coming out, but I think certainly in terms of writing, I think AI written materials should be strictly. They need to be put in their own category. I've noticed now that YouTube and different places, if you are creating content that is AI generated, there's a box you tick: is this AI generated or is it not? And because people, I think at the very least, people need to know what the difference is. If people want to experiment with that and look at that, I mean, you can, but to try to have an AI produced book and stick it out there and put it on the same level as somebody who's done their academic research is that's completely that completely throws away the idea that any information has any validity at all. It's like it goes back to the whole thing of my opinion is as good as your facts. And I think we desperately need to not move in that direction. We need to, understanding that when you're being creative and when you're doing certain things, that there's a certain amount of imagination involved. You don't want to mistake that for what the facts are in a particular situation. We can over rely on facts for certain things, or we can be over focused on facts to the exclusion of other things. But you also don't want to start ignoring facts either, because they do factor in. So anyway, I'm going to probably get off here soon. Project Lethe is the latest one that I've come out with, and this is another Morrigan Timelines one. This is probably my second favorite. As I was talking about the books, the people who joined late, these are the books that I've published, and the new one, Regenerator, is just come out. Like I said, 2 days ago. It's now been released. You can get it on Amazon. Really, because it's released through Ingram, through distribution, you can really order it from any bookstore. If you hate Amazon and you think they're evil, then you can get it from another source as well. But all of them, these particular novels are based around the characters in the Morrigan Timelines, and they're almost like another thing. So Project Lethe is about. I always kind of have a certain twist in my stories, so I don't necessarily want to give too much away. But you basically have two concurrent things going on here. You have Malcolm, who is in Morrigan Timelines. He's the rock star fellow. He's the guitarist fellow, and he's in the second half of Morrigan Timelines. There's an estrangement between him and Layla, and there's an estrangement in this book too. So he's looking for her instead of him just outright continuing to reject her. He wants to look for her. Hires a private detective to look for her. And the information that he gets kind of leads to a dead end, like her national insurance number is canceled, like all this stuff, but there's no death certificate, so nobody knows what's going on here. And then you sort of have a concurrent development of another girl who is coming out of an amnesia called Chthonia, and she's had a terrific crisis, and so she's trying to piece things back together, because it's like she can remember like stuff that she's learned, in school, like your arithmetic, your literature, some of your pop culture, but she can't remember anything about like her family life at all. And so you kind of go through her journey as she kind of gets herself on track, and eventually she really gets herself on track. She gets she's in England, but she manages to get a job in LA, and she meets somebody, and and it's all going to be great. And then all of a sudden, somebody from that who knew her as a child comes in, and just kind of the whole thing just blows up after that. So it's like, yeah, so that's what Project Lethe is about. And Lethe, of course, is the river of forgetfulness, so of course that's where the amnesia theme comes in, but there's a little more to it than that. So and Regenerator is another one. It picks up one of the characters from Morrigan Timelines called Ian James, and he is it basically takes the track if because he's one of the ones who's with Layla in her really oversexed phase, and she likes him, but she's just usually the opposite of what you assume with teenage girls. She's just interested in sex. She's not really interested in him. I mean, she is, and she isn't. She likes him. She thinks he's sweet, but she feels kind of bad. Like, this isn't going to work out, and I feel bad telling him that. But but then it's kind of like he has this kind of ongoing obsession. But you find out that it's not, that the obsession that he has is not not necessarily just because he's just some weirdo who's obsessed. I mean, there's actually something else that's happening there that even Layla is not really cognizant of until the end of the book. So so anyway, that's where Regenerator comes in, and that plays around a little bit with Irish Myth, but again, it takes a lot of license with it. So so these are the latest and greatest things. If you join me late, I am going to be putting some things, like some copies I have a couple copies of Maeve, and I've got some of Death and the Maiden, which is my academic book, which I'm going to be putting up much more cheaply, and it'll include shipping if people want to have copies and don't have them, rather than paying the full Amazon price. I'm gonna be putting something up, and I'll post it here to Instagram. So if you're interested in that, you can see that. And I still have a lot of my Edward Gorey stuff for sale too over on eBay. So and as I said, I'm Bribu _ 6326. That's what I'm called over there, BRIBU. Like I said, I think I've sold about a third of the Gorey stuff, but I'm still clearing out, still trying to get rid of some things. So just letting people know that's still there. Anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. And, I hope you have a great week. I am on Transition Life Coaching, transition.life.coaching every morning, most mornings, doing morning coffee with Breege over there. And that, of course, is my coaching, mentoring, that kind of thing. That's more that angle rather than what I'm doing here with Chthonia. So you can always check me out over there as well. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you next Monday.